All right, for the shadow of the future to have these kinds of effects, though, three things have to be true. Okay, number one, you have to actually know that that's going to happen, or at least expect that that's going to happen. Okay, you could conceivably find yourself back in this same situation with somebody else when neither of you expected to be there, right? And if that's the case, then that's incidental to any decisions you made the first time, right? You didn't know you were going to be back there. You weren't thinking about how is this going to matter in the future. Okay, so I need to know, or at least believe, that we're going to be back in the same situation again. The payoff structure can't be changing to some great extent. Okay? So if I say, for example, look, why don't we just take turns, right? You get what you want this time, I'll get what I want next time. But we both know that the resources that will be available next time are much greater than the resources that are available now. You're not going to take that as a fair deal. Right, so I'm kind of in a crude example. Somehow we could rig the lottery, and I said, well, look, you win this time, and I'll win next time. Okay, except this time the payoff's going to be $20 million, and next time it's going to be $100 million, right? So now we're not fighting over whether we should cooperate. We're fighting over who gets it next time, right? Because that's worth so much more money. Okay. And the third thing is that nobody involved can have too steep of a discount rate. If you remember the discount rate, that's how much you discount future benefits relative to current ones. If both parties involved discount future benefits too much, then they're not going to care that there's a future interaction involved, right? If I can know that there's a future interaction, but all I really care about is what happens right now. If both parties feel that way, then they're not going to be influenced by the potential of future interactions. Okay. However, though, it doesn't, having the potential for future interactions, having that expectation of future interactions, doesn't have to make it more likely that you're going to cooperate, right? So somebody could develop a reputation for untrustworthiness, and that makes it less likely that somebody's going to cooperate with them in the future, right? If you are too willing to forgive, right? People back out of agreements all the time, but you say, you know what, just try to do better next time, okay? And you don't ever retaliate, you don't ever punish them for that. You're going to develop a reputation that people say, you can back out of deals with that guy all the time, and it's not going to matter, right? So now they have less incentive to cooperate with you. And there may be situations where you want to defect now to improve your bargaining situation in the future. The kind of classic formulation of this is to think about, what you always hear in movies about what you should do on your first day in prison, right? What do you do on your first day in prison? You go beat somebody up, right? To make people think that you're not somebody they want to mess with, right? Now, if you're in that situation, or if you're viewing the world through that lens, the fact that there's potential future interactions is actually causing you to defect right now, right? I'm choosing violence now in order to make myself someone people fear and therefore don't want to engage in violence with later, okay? All right, so how do we apply these? How does the shadow of the future in general affect these three games? So if we get to the prisoner's dilemma, okay, remember these two people brought in, they're separated, they're accused of a crime, and they're both told the other one is going to spill the beans and you are going to take the fall, right? Well, what we find is that in an iterative game, okay, when people know that they're going to be in that situation over and over again, they tend to gravitate towards mutual cooperation in the long run. Okay? So if you remember, right, if both sides cooperate, they both got a year in prison in that example, right? If they cooperated and the other person defected, then the person who defected got no time, but the other person got 10 years, right? And if they both defected, they both got 5 years. So think about, even if the first time, right, you cooperate and the other person defects, right? So they go scot-free, you get 10 years, right? You take that heaviest penalty, right? What are you going to do the next time? This person just ratted you out, sent you to prison for 10 years. Now they're saying, hey, don't talk, don't squeal, don't testify against me. What are you going to do? you're going to rat them out, right? You're like, I will happily sit on that stand and I will happily testify against this other person, right? And when that happens, when you're in that situation where people are in a position to retaliate, it doesn't take long before both sides realize that they're better off in the long run cooperating with each other, right? Because 1 year sentence after 1 year sentence after 1 year sentence, it's going to take you, 10 times before you get to that 10-year penalty, right? But man, if you do 10-year penalty or 5-year penalty after 5-year penalty after 5-year penalty, they start to add up really quickly, right? So in Chicken, in the Prisoner's Dilemma, when you have an iterative game, there's a strong incentive to move toward mutual cooperation, even if you don't start out there. Even if people are willing to defect originally, they kind of come to the point where rationally it just makes sense to cooperate, okay? Try to minimize those big penalties. What about in the stag hunt, okay? Well, in the stag hunt, cooperation can really breed future cooperation, right? I build that trustworthiness. I start to develop a sense that these are people I can work with. They're going to stay on task, right? They're going to continue to support our joint efforts to achieve this big goal, right? I'm going to build that trust over time. It's going to be much more likely everybody's going to cooperate, right? But on the other hand, defection can start to eat away at that trust, right? So it kind of depends on what people do. When people start to defect, everybody might say, man, that's 2 or 3 times now. I've been the one left out, right? I didn't get anything. They went after these smaller benefits and got them, and they left me high and dry, and I got nothing, right? You actually can push people towards greater defection because that distrust has grown, right? When it comes to Chicken, in some ways, this is the most interesting one, right? Think about it. So again, you have 2 people driving towards one another, right? Cooperation is swerving, defection is driving straight into the other one, right? Well, if the other person always cooperates, what does that give you an incentive to do? Defect, right? They're going to cooperate. They're going to swerve, right? And so I feel confident I'm not going to end up in that worst case scenario where we actually collide head on, right? And I'm going to move up to my most preferred outcome where, neither of us die, but I get the reputation points and the other person loses them, right? So a pattern of cooperation can actually increase the chances of defection because you feel more confident that you're not going to get that worst outcome, okay? So it is not that having the expectation of future interactions, not that having an iterative game always leads magically to mutual cooperation. It depends on what the game looks like, right? It depends on the situation. All right, questions about that? Okay, then we can think about another factor that matters is how many players, right? We've been thinking, for example, with the Prisoner's Dilemma of just 2 players in this game. We've been thinking with Chicken of 2 players in this game, right? Stag Hunt, it was larger than that, but still, imagining kind of a relatively small group of people overall. Okay, so what difference does it make? Well, generally, the fewer players that you have, the greater the likelihood of cooperation. All right, why? Okay, good. There's fewer loose ends, right? There's fewer people to trust to cooperate, right? I'm less worried. If I have to worry about one person keeping the agreement, right? That's a much better situation than I have to worry about 12 other people all keeping the agreement, right? It's easier when there are fewer players to kind of negotiate, often easier to negotiate outcomes that make everybody happy, right? It's easier for me to compromise with one other person, one other country, and come up with something that makes us both happy. If I've got 12 different countries that are coming together, there might be so many conflicting interests, it becomes really difficult to come up with a deal that's going to keep all 12 countries happy with the result, okay? it also makes it easier to assign blame if the whole thing falls apart. Right? Think about when you do a group project. I know it's everybody's favorite thing in the world to do, right? If it's a project with you and one other person, right? That's your group, right? And and let's say you're going to come in and you're going to do an oral presentation over whatever the project is, right? And there's just two of you. And I will tell you as a professor, it's going to be really obvious to me if one of you did a lot of work and the other one didn't, right? There are going to be parts of that presentation that look really great and polished and really well thought out, and parts of it that are just totally awful. And I will know, right? I will know for sure, right? If it's a group of 10, it's easy for that one person who's not really contributing to kind of hide in the crowd, and for their, contributions or lack of contributions to be made up for by others, okay? So it's a lot harder for me when I've had group assignments where I've had large groups, right? It's harder for me to say, oh yeah, that one person didn't cooperate. That one person didn't do work and therefore doesn't deserve the same grade as everybody else. But man, in a group of 2, it's clear, right? If there's, again, one person who did nothing, I'll know. Your professors know, trust me, okay? Now, if we apply changing the number of players to games, though, it doesn't always have the same effect, right? So think about the prisoner's dilemma, okay? Now it's not just 2 people who have been brought in for questioning, right? It's 5 people who've been brought in for questioning, right? So you and 4 accomplices, right? Now you're much more worried. Right? Now you don't just have to trust one person to keep quiet. You have to trust 4 other people to keep quiet, right? And any one of them could ruin it for everybody else, right? And in fact, in reality, right, in that type of situation, if there's one person who turns on 4 others, that one person's probably going to be able to negotiate a really great deal for himself or herself, right? Whereas in the real world, a prosecutor's probably not going to set you free if you just testify against one other person and you're both equally involved, right? You get a reduced sentence, but you're probably still going to do some time. You're still going to get some sort of punishment, right? But man, if there's a large organization and you're the one person who turns on the rest of the organization, you're probably negotiating a great deal for yourself, right? So the benefits of defection can become much greater with a larger number of players, right? And the risks of cooperating get greater the larger the number of players. Okay, in the stag hunt, right, some of the specifics are going to really start to matter, right? So let's say that, instead of a group of 5 or 6 people hunting the stag, now we do have a dozen people, right? Maybe it doesn't matter if one person defects, right? Maybe with 11 people, we still can achieve our goal, right? And so we're less worried about defection than we were before, right? Because maybe with 5, if one person defects, we're almost certainly going to lose our main goal, right? We're not going to achieve our goal. But enough people, maybe that one person's defection doesn't really matter very much, right? And if that's the case, right, now suddenly I may have less of an incentive to defect because it's more likely we're going to achieve the big goal, and if the payout, even if 1/12 of that big goal is greater than the rabbit, right, I'm kind of foolish to leave the big goal behind and just go after my own individual but small payout, okay? When it's a situation where the group's not going to get the stag if anybody defects, that rabbit might start to look really good, right? But if they're probably going to get it without me, and they're going to all get a much bigger payout than I am, I have a greater incentive to cooperate. Okay, so in prisoner's dilemma, it probably makes cooperation less likely. Stag hunt, it makes cooperation more likely. Okay. And then my favorite example here to think about, my favorite game to think about in this case is chicken, right? So now we've gone from 2 cars driving toward one another. Now we've got 6 cars all driving toward a central point, right? Man, that makes the calculations infinitely more difficult if you're driving that car, right? You just need one of those other people to keep driving to make your best chance to, choice to get out, right? I'm gonna get out, I'm gonna swerve, I don't care, think I'm a chicken, think whatever you want of me, right? There's no way that I'm trusting all of these other people, right? And I don't know, trying to imagine how you raise that up to, say 50, 70, 150 players all in this game. I don't know that I can make that work in my head, or certainly can't draw it on the board, okay? So it is not that, again, just like the shadow of the future, it doesn't always produce the same result, right? The number of players don't always produce the same result. It depends on what the structure of the game is. It can get different, or lead to different outcomes, but it certainly has the potential to matter, right? So what do you take from all of this if you are a president? You're dealing with other countries, right? Well, first of all, you have to understand the costs and benefits of whatever the issue is from multiple perspectives, because they're not necessarily all going to be the same, right? We've been thinking about these simple games where, everybody faces the same choices, basically, right? It's not that one person gets a much greater benefit if they defect than somebody else, right? Everybody has the same set of choices. But in the real world, that's not going to be the case, right? And so you need to think about, do some states, do some actors have greater costs of defection? Do some states get greater benefits from defection? Do some states get greater benefits from cooperation or pay greater costs from cooperation, right? And you can attempt to shape those incentives, right? What can I do to change the payout structure so that it is a better decision for this other state, this other actor that I am negotiating with to cooperate, right? You got to keep in mind that past decisions are going to influence future decisions, right? So whatever I decide now, whether it's cooperation or it's defection, is that going to make it more likely in the future that somebody cooperates with me, or is that going to make it less likely that somebody cooperates with me? We got to think about information, right? The more that you can control information, often the better off you are. It doesn't mean you don't want other people to have information. You just want to decide which information they have and which information they don't have, right? So in some cases, it may be in your interest to share all the information that you have, because it really is the case that they would be much, much better off cooperating with you than defecting. But in other cases, you may want to limit the scope of information to the best of your ability, because maybe you don't want them to know that they'd be better off reneging on the deal that they're about to make with you, or refusing to make a deal with you. Okay? You got to keep in mind that, and by the way, just as a real example of controlling that information, right? It's always the case, has been for decades, regardless of who the president is, that the United States never says, if China invades Taiwan, we will respond, right? And they certainly never say, if China invades Taiwan, we won't respond, right? So why is that? Basically, the policy of the United States is to allow uncertainty to play a role in the calculations of the Chinese government, right? They don't know whether the United States would respond or not, and they have to calculate that. They have to think about these different scenarios, and it makes it harder for them to figure out the best strategy and what to do, right? Whereas if they had great certainty, they thought they understood what the situation was, then it would be clearer for them to decide on a strategy if they wanted to take over Taiwan, right? So think about if you knew the United States was going to respond, and you could try to increase the cost of the United States respond by creating problems elsewhere in the world, right? That might be helpful if the United States was not planning to respond. What if the United States really wasn't planning to respond, and now you've essentially attacked the United States elsewhere in the world? Now you've made it more likely the United States is going to respond in Taiwan, right? So we want that uncertainty to kind of limit actions that the Chinese government might take, or make planning a strategy for capturing Taiwan much more difficult, okay? We do have to keep in mind that because the United States is a superpower, other countries usually assume the United States is going to pay the larger share of whatever burdens are involved in any sort of agreement, okay? And we do have to keep in mind, finally, that the lines between domestic and international politics can be blurred, right? So what helps you internationally could hurt you domestically. What helps you domestically could hurt you internationally, right? it's not the same audiences. They don't necessarily want the same things, and that can make things much more complicated. All right, questions about any of that? All right, and we'll wrap up a little bit early. Start your Thanksgiving break. Enjoy the break. I will see you in a little over a week, and we'll go from there.